Ambassador Bolton, welcome back to the Daily Tea. Now, Tim Stanley and me, we spoke to you in August, and at that stage you said that Donald Trump wasn't fit to be president. You said you would be filling in your voting slip with Dick Cheney. Obviously, your book, published in 2020, The Room Where It Happened, revealed many of the crises and the mess of his first term. I just wondered, Ambassador Bolton, whether you had changed your mind at all, or whether you are just as fearful about the next 4 years as you were when you last spoke to us in August, and what that 4 years might look like.
Well, the short answer is yes, I'm still just as worried. I should correct one thing. It turned out since our last conversation, Dick Cheney and his daughter Liz, both longtime friends of mine, decided to vote for Kamala Harris. So I thought, in light of that development, I ought to rethink who I was going to write in. And indeed, in this election, I wrote in Mike Pence, former vice president, who on the famous January the 6th did the right thing by the Constitution, and so I voted for him. No, Mike Pence wave developed across the country, so we've ended up with Trump as president. He is today the beneficiary of 4 years of experience from his first term, but my prediction would be that he begins roughly where he left off on January the 20th, 2021, and then it probably goes downhill from there. Now, you will be hearing from election night forward for the next several weeks the euphoria of a victorious candidate and the predictions for an orderly transition, an orderly conduct of the presidency will dominate the airwaves. And it's entirely natural after a victory that people are optimistic. They think all possibilities are open. And people merely need to consult the record of Prime Minister Starmer in his first 100 days from the optimism of a sweeping victory in your last election to see what can happen to the best laid plans. Trump himself has not changed, and that is the fundamental source of the chaos that threatens his second term.
Ambassador, you'll appreciate that one of the biggest concerns on this side of the Atlantic is what happens now in Ukraine. President-elect Trump has been very clear that he says he could end that war in 24 hours. What do you think it means, and what's he going to do?
Well, I don't think he really knows, but what he's reflecting is the effort to show he's not Joe Biden, and that whatever Joe Biden did is wrong, and that he will fix. So he has said, for example, had he been president, the Russians never would have invaded Ukraine in 2022. He said the same thing about the war in the Middle East. If he had been president, it never would have happened. Now, neither of those statements is subject to being proven or disproven. But what Trump wants to do, and he'd like to do it by January the 20th, Inauguration Day, if he could, is get both wars off the table. And he doesn't particularly care how. Now, I don't think that will happen either in the Middle East or in Ukraine, but I think trying to find an end to the war in Ukraine will be a high Trump priority. And so when he says, I can fix it, it means that he will make that effort one way or another. I believe it will fail because I think in Ukraine it's much more complicated than Trump understands. So if Trump makes the effort and fails, I can guarantee you it will not be Trump's fault, because it's never Trump's fault. Therefore, it will be either Zelensky's fault or Putin's fault. And I'm very concerned that it will be an easy step for Trump to conclude it must be Zelensky's fault, and the consequences for Ukraine will be very serious.
Is there a possibility, I think perhaps this is what people fear, that he will say to the Ukrainians, do a deal with Russia, cede the land that Russia has already taken, and if you don't, I'll withdraw US support. Could that happen?
Yeah, yes, I think it's a very likely scenario. Trump's advisors have said something like that. They've also included a threat to Russia that if they don't negotiate, unstated adverse consequences will follow. I don't think that's a credible threat. But about 5 or 6 weeks ago, J.D. Vance, the now vice president-elect, said publicly he thought a good solution in Ukraine would be Russia keeps the territory that it currently holds. You create a demilitarized zone between the front lines of Russian troops and Ukrainian troops. Ukraine agrees not to enter NATO, and that's the solution right there. I think the Kremlin would welcome that. I think their only criticism would be of themselves that they didn't ask for more, because they would have gotten it.
And Ambassador Bolton, why do you think that that plan will fail? Because Europe will not be able to take the place in terms of military assistance that the role that America is undertaking at the moment. So why would that plan fail? Is that not what is going to happen?
Well, I'm sorry if I was confusing. I don't think it will fail. I'm afraid that's the plan, that it's going to be take it or leave it for Ukraine. And, I don't, we've just seen the collapse of the German coalition earlier this week. President Macron is overwhelmed with domestic difficulties. Starmer has his own problems. I just don't see Europe being able to step in. I think the feeling that Putin has outlasted us will prevail, and that you'll see a lot of people in Europe, if Trump follows through on that line, a lot of people in Europe will say, let's turn the page.
And Ambassador Bolton, what about his approach, or President-elect's approach to NATO? If he does get a deal to end the war between Russia and Ukraine, what might his attitude be to NATO?
Well, I remain very concerned about NATO as well. Trump came very close to withdrawing in his first term, and I think the desire to withdraw continues. I don't think he basically understands collective defense alliances, whether multilateral, as in the case of NATO, or bilateral, as in the case of our mutual defense pacts with Japan, South Korea, and others. He continues to see Europe, not to mention Canada, as free riding on the United States. In his view, it's not a correct view, but in his view, the U.S. is defending Europe, doesn't get anything out of it, and the Europeans aren't paying their expenses. So for him, it's a very easy step to conclude that we might as well get out. Now, there will be debate about that within the administration, almost without regard to whom he picks for senior positions, because there's a lot of support for NATO. It's not going to be accepted well in Congress, but presidents control foreign policy. There's a statute that says the U.S. can't withdraw from NATO unless the House and the Senate approve. That statute is almost certainly unconstitutional. I've helped presidents get out of several treaties, and the Senate and the House role is zero. So, and knowing Donald Trump, even if confronted with that statute, he'll say, fine, I'm going to withdraw, let them sue me.
Ambassador Bolton, just to make sure I'm absolutely clear, so you think that America, under President-elect Trump, will pull out of NATO? That is surely the end of the alliance.
Well, I think it would be the end of the alliance. It would be a catastrophic mistake. And there are, I think, ways to prevent it. Playing off of Trump's very short attention span, other NATO leaders should try and distract him. And you say, well, it's going to be hard to distract him for 4 years, and that's correct. But that's the best solution I would offer.
Mm. Fascinating. In terms of the conflict in the Middle East, Ambassador, what do you think Trump's approach there will be? What do you expect him to do?
As in the case of Ukraine, I think he'd like this to disappear by January the 20th. He has said as much. He did speak on Wednesday with Prime Minister Netanyahu. The readout from that call on both sides was pretty vague, pretty insignificant. But my guess is that whether through that conversation or other channels, that Trump has basically said this is your opportunity. This transition period we're now in between the election and the inauguration is a time for Israel to do what it needs to do to finish the war up. And if that includes an attack on Iran's nuclear facilities, it would be the time to do it. My own personal view has been for many years that the only path to lasting peace and security in the Middle East is a new regime in Tehran, which isn't going to happen by January the 20th. But doing severe damage to the nuclear program is a possibility. We're still waiting to see if Iran retaliates against Israel's attack on its ballistic missile fuel facilities and its air defenses a couple of weeks ago. So I think the situation in the Middle East remains very unstable. If it's still in its current configuration when Trump takes office, I think his predominant view is, I want this finished, and he doesn't care particularly about what the terms of that resolution would be. He wants it off the table. He sees it as a Biden war, and he just doesn't want to deal with it.
What advice would you give Keir Starmer here? We've been talking, Gordon and I, that there's almost nobody in Western democracies who is more diametrically opposed to Donald Trump's political philosophy and approach than Keir Starmer and the Labour government here in the UK. What advice would you give the British Prime Minister on dealing with somebody with which, on climate change, on Europe, on Ukraine, possibly on the Middle East, you have such fundamental disagreements with?
Well, I guess my best piece of advice would be to say good luck. The way to approach Trump is to understand that he doesn't really have a philosophy. So in a sense, I guess I'm disagreeing with your perspective because of the nature of Trump. Not that that we don't understand what Starmer's views are and what the views of many of Trump's advisors and supporters are. But Trump personally has no philosophy. He doesn't do policy in the way we conventionally use that word. He is transactional, ad hoc, episodic, and he sees things through the prism of how does this benefit Donald Trump. So if I were advising Prime Minister Starmer, I would say focus on what UK interests are and try and do deals piece by piece by piece. This will be unappealing and maybe unsatisfactory in many respects, but if you try and arrange a big picture alignment with Trump, it will fail because he doesn't do big picture. Figure what you want concretely, explain why it will benefit Donald Trump to agree to it, and Starmer may actually get a lot accomplished.
Well, one of the other things I think people on this side of the Atlantic are worried about, along with the ongoing wars, is all the talk from Trump about tariffs. What do you think he will do about it on tariffs? Do you think he'll follow through on what he's said he's going to do? And what can we do about it from over here?
I do think this question of tariffs is significant and very dangerous for the global economy. You will hear from inside the Trump advisory camp, which includes a lot of people who have probably never spoken to Donald Trump more than about 10 words when they had a photo opportunity with him. But they've got plans about how the tariffs will initially be very targeted and will have deregulation in the United States to improve the economy and reduce restrictions on environmental issues that the Biden administration imposed. And then maybe 2 years from now will come massive tariffs. That's a possible scenario with Donald Trump. Anything is a possible scenario. But he believes he understands tariffs and their implications because it's a matter of dollars and cents. But it's a very simplistic view. Tariffs are good. Trade surpluses are good. Trade deficits are bad. And imposing tariffs will tax foreign governments, that we will be getting in revenue from foreigners and we can reduce American income taxes. He has said this. And he doesn't apparently understand that when you tariff goods being imported into the United States, that the sellers of those goods will raise their prices as much as they can to compensate for the tariffs, and American consumers will pay more. He doesn't get that point. So he doesn't see the downside. And therefore, I think the resort to tariffs, which he believes he has the authority to do, and that's a separate question. Many people don't think he has statutory authority now. He thinks he does. And again, he'll act and tell opponents to sue him. That the temptation to wield the tariff hammer will be too hard to resist. He thinks the European Union has shafted the United States on trade negotiations for decades. He thinks the same about many other allies. He's irritated with China. So I think this is a very serious problem, notwithstanding some of his advisors are saying we're actually much more sophisticated than that. His advisors may well be more sophisticated, but they're not the president.
A lot of people here, there's been a lot of talk about a trade deal with the US, particularly when the Conservatives were in power. Do you think there is still a possibility that Britain could do a free trade deal with the US? Is that something Trump would like? You mentioned the EU. Obviously, Britain has now left the EU. Do you see that as an opportunity for Britain to do a trade deal, or is that pie in the sky?
No, I think Trump would be receptive to it. Trump was very supportive of the EU, of the UK exiting the European Union back when the 2016 referendum was held. And it's been a problem for Britain, in my view, and I think in Trump's view, that the constant conflict over the outcome of the referendum has paralyzed Britain's ability to take advantage of the benefits of getting out of the EU. But notwithstanding that you've got a Labour government instead of a Conservative government, I would recommend you try and avoid the failure of the prior Conservative governments to get a trade deal with the U.S. They did get one with Canada. This is a huge opportunity, and if you were asking what could Starmer press on that Trump would see as a benefit, if he could explain why a bilateral trade deal between the UK and the US would enhance Donald Trump's reputation, that would be a way to go.
You may not have seen, but it's just been announced here in the last couple of hours that Jonathan Powell has been appointed as Keir Starmer's national security advisor here. Just wondering, Ambassador Bolton, did you work at all with Jonathan Powell when he was chief of staff to Tony Blair, particularly over the various conflicts in the Middle East?
I did not at that time, no. I mean, I obviously know the name, and I think it's a name that many in the United States would know, at least in the Democratic Party. I don't know what his contacts are in the Republican Party, but I can say from my own experience with Mark Sedwell when I was National Security Advisor, and really going back to the Reagan-Thatcher years, it's a very important channel of communication between the leaders of the country, and really in some senses more important than our respective ambassadors in capitals. Telephones allow direct communication, and people obviously take advantage of it.
We've seen also that President-elect Trump has appointed Susie Wild to be his chief of staff. What can you tell us about Susie Wild, and what does that appointment mean?
Well, I think she's a very respected politician. She and her colleague Chris LaCivita obviously ran the most disciplined campaign they could, given Trump. They ran the campaign and let Trump do what he wanted to do. She has a very difficult job in front of her. And remembering chief of staff of the White House, it's obviously political, but it's not an electoral job. It's a governance job. And governance is very different from electoral politics. In Trump's first term, he made, as his chief of staff, Reince Priebus, the chairman of the Republican National Committee. Very, very experienced, savvy politician with no experience in Washington. He also brought in other people from the campaign, Steve Bannon as the strategist, Kellyanne Conway as a pollster. Both Priebus and Bannon were out within 6 months. So I think it's a very difficult job she's undertaken, and the question will be, can she do as good a job in a governance context as she did in the electoral context? And we don't know the answer to that.
Ambassador Bolton, it's been great to catch up with you. Just finally, you didn't want Donald Trump to win. He won, and he won big. What now for the next 4 years for you?
Well, I'm not sitting home alone by the phone waiting for it to ring with the offer of a job in the Trump administration. That's for sure. I'm gonna continue the battle for the Republican Party. I'm very worried about the strain of isolationism that Trump has unleashed and has been picked up, unfortunately, by his vice president and by others. I think it's a very serious problem and something that's going to require a lot of attention. I think it's important to remember Trump is a lame duck the day he's sworn in. Constitution precludes him from running for a third term. So he's a new president now, but he's an old president too. He only has 4 years. And senators, for example, who were elected on Tuesday night will have terms that expire after Trump leaves office. So the battle goes on, and it will be quite an interesting 4 years.
Ambassador Bolton, thank you so much for joining the Daily Tea.
Thanks for having me.